7 children were among a group of 52 people deported to Georgia last night on a chartered flight out of Dublin Airport. It is the 6th deportation operation so far this year, as the government clamps down on failed asylum applications. But is the coalition now shifting to the right in immigration itself, with the Tánaiste saying migration numbers are now too high? Joining me to discuss this are Fianna Fáil Minister of State Timmy Dooley, Sinn Féin TD and spokesperson on justice and migration Matt Carthy, and Mick Clifford, special correspondent with the Irish Examiner. You can send us your comments. Simply scan the QR code or contact us via the WhatsApp number. Timmy, do you agree with Simon Harris that the numbers are too high?
Well, the reality is people come and they seek asylum. And what every state needs to have is a system that works. And a system that works is based on rules. You reach the threshold or the criteria and you're accepted and you're afforded asylum, if that's the case. If you don't reach the threshold, you don't comply with the rules that are set out by the state, that are in line with international conventions, then you're not granted asylum. There's process of appeals, etc. And any system worth its weight in salt has to have the capacity to assist people in their return or ask them to return. If that doesn't happen, then you've got to go to the more extreme situation of issuing a deportation order. And of course, that then does require, if it's to be a functioning system, fit for purpose, that you have to take action like what has been taken last night and on a number of occasions this year and previously as well. Now, I know that's difficult. It's difficult for all of us because you're dealing with human stories. In many cases, you're dealing with people who saw the asylum process, but, maybe didn't feel that they complied with it, but they had a shot. Irish people have done that too. We've travelled to other countries. We've found ways around the system. We were economic migrants in many cases. And many of our friends in our communities found themselves returned or deported, particularly from the United States.
I'm not sure you've answered the question. Do you agree with Simon Harris that the numbers are too high?
I think it's not about the number being too high. It's about, are you in a position to process those that show up? Just because a number breaches a certain thing and puts pressure on the state, saying whether it's too high or too low is irrelevant. It's about understanding how we have a functioning system. I don't know. I don't know.
And double down on it, and he's got his Fine Gael colleagues backing him up. I appreciate you're not Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil, but he's got his Fine Gael colleagues backing him up. He even went so far as to suggest that there are people who are trying to shut down a debate and a discussion about migration into this country.
I would agree with this. There are people who I would meet who would say they're concerned to the point where a system has to be appropriate and functioning, and that you're then in a position for those who do gain asylum, that you're able to give them the appropriate services that they deserve, quite frankly, and that you're able to accommodate them and you're able to manage through it. The one thing that there is a problem with is housing right across the state. And the more that come to seek asylum, the more pressure it puts on that system. That's a truism. And I think people accept that. And there are many people who would reflect on that and say, well, I don't want to speak out about it because I will be branded as right-wing, which of course is not the case. You can talk about the pressures on the system, but you must recognise that people, they're all humans, they show up with different motivation. I think what we have to try to do and do more efficiently, and I think we're certainly getting there, is that the process works well, that those that unfortunately from their perspective don't meet the threshold, that they're assisted, treated in absolute, in a humane way. But we have to be, as well as being fair, we also need to be firm.
It's funny, though, you mentioned, people getting accused of being racist. About 2 years ago, just under 2 years ago, the Rural Independence Group and the Dáil brought forward a motion calling for a debate and discussion on Ireland's migration policy. And they were rounded upon from the government benches, and they were called every name under the sun. They were called xenophobic, they were called racist, they were accused of dog whistling and what have you. And the government went so far as to bring their own counter motion welcoming the numbers of migrants coming to this country. Simon Harris now sounds like he's singing off their hymn sheet.
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, you can...
It's almost word for word the same thing. We need to have a discussion. And then when people were critical of him, he said people are trying to shut down the debate, which is exactly what they were saying.
I know, but there's a context. And there are some parties and there are some individuals, both within and outside the Dáil, who have an ideological position on migration. And it shouldn't be over that. We have a system.
If one of them used the language that Simon Harris was now using, they would be accused of racism and xenophobia.
But in the first instance...
I mean, is Simon Harris a racist?
The Tánaiste firmly supports the system that we have. And it's very clear that he and all of us in government, and I think across the opposition benches by and large as well, want to see that fair system that treats people equally and with respect. But the system needs to work. And you can't have a system that allows people to remain on indefinitely and doesn't have an exit strategy for them, that you leave open then a situation where those who would want to exploit a situation like that from a racist perspective and from an ideological perspective sort of suggest that the state is at sixes and sevens in terms of migration policy.
Mick, is it telling that Simon Harris keeps talking about the numbers of people migrating to this country as opposed to the number of asylum seekers?
Well, for example, Kieran, you asked Timmy about migration, and Timmy launched straight into the international protection system. He did not talk about migration, he talked about international protection. International protection system accounts for somewhere between 10 and 15% of people coming into this country annually. It is down by 40% this year. That's nearly half, down by 40%. And yet, that is the small element of migration that everybody is concentrating on. And why? One of the reasons is they don't want to face up to the fact that migration has been... there's about 1 in every 5 workers were not born in this country. Migration, to the greatest extent, has been here to serve the economy, both in terms of filling jobs and providing services. Now, we should have a discussion about it if people are uneasy at the level of it. That discussion should not focus on the relatively small number that come here seeking international protection who are fleeing war of some sort or another. Neither should it focus on the very small number who should be deported and who will be deported, but maybe there's an issue over how long it takes to deport them. If you're going to talk about migration, you talk about how are we going to change how we live, how are services going to change, how is the economy going to change. This focus that there is an international protection is feeding straight into this whole area where people are trying to generate anger and resentment against a very small number of people.
Is it not also the case, though, Mick, that people look at the breakdown and they see, right, 50% of the people who do come to this country, they're either Irish citizens returning home, they're from the UK or they're from the EU. There's not much you can do about any of them. I don't think anybody would want to turn
unless
off
you
that
leave
tap.
the EU.
Of the other half, the overwhelming majority of them are people from the rest of the world, as it's classified by the CSO, but who come here with visas. They come here to work in the HSE or they're coming to work in tech or pharma. And people realise that you'd be undermining the economy were you to try and turn off that tap.
Exactly. And
it only leaves one place to go.
Precisely, and that place is the smallest cohort of those coming into the country. And you could argue, within that cohort, those who are accepted for protection are a cohort that are fleeing war and oppression of one kind of another. Yet, that is the cohort.
So then do we need to have a conversation? If we're going to have a conversation about migration, which is what Simon Harris wants, a conversation about those other people, the rest of the world who come here on visas.
For example, Kieran, there's a new system they're looking into work visas, and from what I can gather, they're looking into how they can expand work visas. So if we're doing that on one hand, and if we're throwing all the blame on a very small number of people on the other, where is it going? People don't want to have the awkward conversation. If people are uneasy with the level of migration and they want it reduced, there has to be a conversation about how you go about that. This notion that you go about it, for instance, by stopping people coming in who are fleeing oppression, I think that would reduce what Ireland's supposed to be from in all sorts of ways. So either have the conversation or don't, but do not blame the smallest cohort who are vulnerable, most of them, in terms of why they want to be here.
Matt, 125,000 people moved to this country last year. Now, that's often the figure cited. People left the country as well, so it's a kind of 60-odd thousand net increase. Is that too much?
So I think the figure is a bit higher than that in terms of net terms. I'm conscious when we're talking about migration that this week we could be talking about multiple fatalities in Drogheda as a result of a dastardly act, which I hope those responsible for are brought to justice. And I think that needs to be condemned universally. But I also think it's very important that commentators and politicians don't equate anybody who raises concerns around immigration with people who carry out acts such as that or who would condone them. I think it is really important. One of the one of the issues that's raised with me constantly is this sense that you can't say anything, you can't raise a criticism of the immigration policy whatsoever because you're branded as a racist.
Now.
And I think that's welcome.
And I think we've all gotten to the point where we accept that this is government policy, and like whether it's health or education or transport or justice,
to answer your question,
you can talk about
to
it.
answer your question is black and white. We do not have the capacity in terms of housing, just as one example, to deal with the increases in population that we've seen.
Okay,
now,
so
that's
then
not
when you look at the figures, though, the breakdown, where does the reduction come from?
Okay.
You can't, well, you tell me. So we went through it. We won't bamboozle people with numbers again. You've got Irish people, people from the UK, EU citizens, visa holders, asylum seekers. Which number are you going to try and reduce?
Okay, so, well, first of all, we need to build the capacity that I've spoken about in terms of housing, in terms of education, and we need to do that in terms of for the domestic Irish population as well as for people moving in. So the IPAS system does need to be fixed. And just in terms of mixed, one of the reasons why so much of the debate revolves around the IPAS system is because it is completely dysfunctional. Because you have a system where the process is not working. The processing time for applications is taken far too long. The decisions, when they're made, are not enforced, and government do not know where the vast majority of people who have been unsuccessful are, whether they're still in the state or not. And above all, the biggest single criticism that you hear across communities all over this state is that they have been ignored in terms of what's happening in their areas, in terms of accommodation centres, and they're watching on as a small number of people are making absolute fortunes. All of those are legitimate criticisms, and none of them are directed at people who are coming here seeking international protection.
They're legitimate criticisms, but they're not an answer to the question that I asked.
So you have to get all,
in which category would you try and reduce the number?
So you have to get all of those things right. Then when it comes to employment and student visas, for example, you have to have a consideration beyond what big corporations want. So in terms of employment visas, yes, we need people in key services, key industries. There's lots of different sectors that are crying out for more workers, and they're looking at employment visas as the only way to fill that. But you can't just allocate visas and not have a plan in terms of housing those people who are coming here. And that's the difficulty, because the pressures create the type of divisions that we've seen. Likewise, so we have student visas, and international students are critically important to university life and to the success of universities. But you can't have a huge increase in student visa numbers, which we've seen over the past number of years, and not have an eye to the fact that there's also a student accommodation crisis, and the fact that there's a whole cottage industry built up around what are called English language courses. So you have to reduce the number of visas that we issue to workers and students. You have to deal with all of these things in the round. But you can't deal with any one of them. That's the simple answer to the question I asked. That's the column you would seek to reduce. I think you look at each individually, you look at where the pressures are on the system, and the system is under pressure, and you put forward policies to address them. And you recognise that at the moment there is no policy, there is no plan, there is no strategy. It is, yes, we all recognise that workers coming from other parts of the world play an integral part in critical sectors, but we also have to deal with the outworkings of that.
So one thing, Kieran, I mean, Matt's point about people are saying we can't say anything, you're called racist. That on one level is grand, but when people say you can't say anything, and then you look at what is being said, you look on social media, you look on some outlets that are obsessed with immigration, and what's being said does not bear any relationship to reality. It is not based on facts. It is based on impressions. It's based on pandering. It's based on attempting to ensure that people become resentful in that by some of these outlets and on social media. So this notion that you can't say anything, I don't accept that at all. But what you should not be able to say is to spread lies, which we have seen constantly. On the most basic level, the Gardaí every so often reference this, and that's purely in relation to crime. That happens right across the board. So yes, there should be absolutely a conversation about it, but a conversation based entirely on facts. And one other thing, in terms of communities, yes, communities are under pressure for services, absolutely everywhere. But what we don't hear about is the large number of communities that don't react badly to people within their community being put there, and I know plenty of them myself. And so we have to take that into account as well. They are silent on it, but they're the ones who are also bearing the burden, but they're doing so without reacting badly to it.
Timmy, should we be reducing the number of visas we issue to workers and students?
No, I don't think so. Absolutely not. Quite frankly, if our economy is to grow and develop along the lines that it needs to, we need workers to come from outside. We need to have an effective.
Where are we going to put all these people?
We've got to continue.
Which ultimately kind of boils down to, doesn't it?
That, but the pressure is there on the housing system, and we are addressing that. We are coming to terms with that. And it's interesting that poor Sister Stanislaus Kennedy, who just passed away yesterday, when she set up the migrant organisation that she did, and I watched her on television last night, or a clip from a bygone time, where she recognised how important that migration was to the development of our own society. And I think we've got to look at from that perspective and look at the richness of that interaction of people coming to be part of our country and settling down and broadening our society. But also there are people prepared to come here on visas to do work, quite frankly, that we don't have people to do in our society, whether it be at the very high-end level or to do the more service level work rate. People came before from...
I don't want to say it, but it sounds like you profoundly disagree with Simon Harris then when he says migration numbers are too high.
No, that's why I pivoted towards the issue that is has generated most of the debate. And I don't want to deter from what Mick has said, but that's where the vast amount of the misinformation that's in circulation, for sure.
Yeah, but when there are people with a racist numbers,
but I want to make this point. There are people with a racist bent for whom somebody of a different skin colour is a problem. But they'll never talk about it. They will always say, oh, well, we need the doctors, we need the nurses, we need the care workers. But it's the unvetted males that rock up and they're going to do the devil and all to our women and our children. They're using the asylum seeker process, because it has been broken for some time. They're using that as a soft in to influence, as Mick has said, people who maybe aren't fully aware of what's going on, haven't thought it through, but now they're on to, it's the gateway to racism for those that have an ideological position. And in my view, we've got to address that. And I believe the government is addressing that. But no, I don't believe that we should be looking at some kind of a cap on migration, which is part of a system-wide approach that's a response to the demands and needs of a growing economy.
Even if one of the consequences to that, to issuing those visas, is the continuation of the housing crisis, or the elongation.
The sort of corollary of that, quite frankly, if you take it to its nth degree, is that those companies which are driving the economy, which are providing significant resources to allow us to build infrastructure, to build the houses, can I just finish on this, Matt, that they may not see Ireland as a suitable location. And I know the work that the IDA and Enterprise Ireland and others do, but one of the biggest questions they have in terms of attracting companies is, where's the workforce coming from? You're at full employment.
But there are caps on employment visas per sector. The difficulty is that the only consideration in the cap is the gaps within the employment source, which of course is very important, but it shouldn't be the only consideration when you're actually identifying how many workers a state can accommodate. You have to take into account the capacity of the state, of services, of housing. Because if you don't, then you end up with the situation that we have in many parts of the state. Where not only, well, on one hand, you're encouraging and welcoming people who are coming to work in our health services, and then on the other hand, we have entire hospitals in Sydney that are made up of Irish staff.
But it's very difficult to turn around to those. I know you say you can't kind of operate government policy at the whim of big tech or big pharma, but big tech and big pharma and those big corporations, as you describe them, pay an awful lot of money into the coffers here, and an awful lot of Sinn Féin spending policy is based on that money being in those coffers. I'm not suggesting you discount the need of those sectors. I'm saying it's not the only consideration. There is no other area of public policy that you would allow to be dictated at the whim of one vested interest, regardless of who it is. You have to have a holistic overview. You also acknowledge that is an area you'd like to see a reduction in the number of people coming here. Now, I don't think you want to see a reduction in the number of people working in our hospitals.
No, absolutely not.
Which means that you're going to turn around to those companies and say, listen, I'm sorry, we don't want to do it, but we don't have enough housing. You cannot hire the software engineers you need to. And at least be honest about it.
At the moment, a lot of those companies are finding it difficult to get staff precisely because the staff, even if they're able to employ them, have nowhere to live. So you have to take into account all factors. If you don't, then you are creating the space for very nasty actors to actually manipulate people's concerns and to turn it into racist tendencies. So
that's true too. But if the message goes out that Ireland is full, that we're not able to manage a greater level of migration, that we're not able to accommodate more workers, that sends a very negative signal to the wave of investment which has driven this economy for generations now. So,
and that's not what I said at all.
I know, but it's just the nuanced point that if you say or do anything that seeks to distract from the path that you're on in terms of a growth, you're in trouble. And I mean, we see other economies across. You see the stagnation in other economies where their birth rates are low, where they're not attractive in terms of inward migration, and the impact that has on a stagnation in economic activity. So we've got to be really careful here. Yes, there are tensions. There are competitive tensions, but I think we have to work to build the infrastructure, and we've got to continue to do that.
But you're not doing that, Timmy.
No, but we are, Matt, and you know that. That's a political point. We can argue that point on a political level.
The economy, Timmy, is based on corporate tax take. And for that, the point you're making about bringing in people, absolutely. But the other side of that coin is that in communities that are being left behind as a result of the model we have, that there is generating a sense of resentment that these people are being left behind, and that turns on immigrants as a result. This is basic stuff. It's been happening all over Europe, and it's happening here in a particular way because of the way the economy is structured, and that people in certain communities are being left behind in terms of services and what they see as a lack of opportunity.
Well, listen, Simon Harris will be happy we're having the discussion.